Chapter 101, Section 101. The upper reaches of the Dragon Ball world were on par with the Marvel Universe, so treasures from there were naturally extraordinary. System-made items were even more exquisite. Every time you broke through a stage, you could take Super God water to increase your potential. It also cleared negative effects. It was an invaluable boon. Shufu stretched out his hand and a small, deceptively cute teapot appeared. A red character meaning God was engraved on its side, as if holding a mysterious power. He shook it and could hear liquid sloshing inside. He produced a cup, poured, and an amber liquid flowed out with a soft, jasmine-like chime. A white, sacred mist hovered over it. It looked exceptional. He didn't hesitate and drank it all in one gulp. He exhaled a white breath as a warm current slid down his throat into his stomach and then spread through his whole body. He felt warm and every cell seemed to come alive. He could clearly sense the rate at which his superhuman body absorbed solar radiation more than doubled. His body felt purified, his mind relaxed. "The effect is tremendous," he murmured, pleased. This sort of potential boost didn't last forever. He reckoned the cup's benefit would hold for about a week. Even so, it was like receiving a buff that doubled his cultivation speed and granted immunity to all poisons. After the system's purification, ordinary people could drink Super God water without worry. This was Skyfather-level stuff. Best of all, the teapot could be refilled by inputting energy, simple and convenient. If he could get more of this, it would be a huge boon. It was essential for cultivation in such a dangerous world. Satisfied, Shufu put the teapot away, baited his line again, and cast his rod, taking advantage of his good luck to try and catch something else. System products were always high quality. Any catch would be strengthening. But fate seemed in a playful mood. He fished for hours without another harvest. Reluctantly, he sheathed his rod and headed back to eat. He could maintain the effect of fasting through energy now and didn't need to eat, but he enjoyed food anyway. As he walked from the reef toward the beach, a commotion in the woods caught his ear. It was in English, which surprised him. Africa's linguistic landscape was complicated. Indigenous tongues and colonial languages mixed in strange ways. English speakers this far inland were unusual. Some of the voices sounded familiar, and his curiosity pulled him toward the sound. He waited on the shore and watched a group emerge from the trees. They looked like refugees, clothes torn, faces pale, hair unkempt. Even in Africa, such a ragged crowd drew attention. They weren't all dark-skinned. There were people of various complexions among them. As Shufu tried to place the voices, a familiar figure stepped out ahead of the group. "Eric, what are you doing here?" he called. At the sound, the ragged crowd stiffened and went on guard. Colorful lights blinked around some of them, and several displayed clear physical mutations. "Huh? Are they all mutants?" Shufu's surprise spiked. Hundreds of beggars, mutants? How was that possible? Even at the Mutant Academy's height, there were only thousands of mutants in total. Were there hundreds here? Had Magneto gathered mutants from across Africa? Magneto steadied the group with a few words and gestures, then walked over. "Shufu, why are you here?" he asked. "Fishing," Shufu replied simply. Then he asked the real question. "Why are you here?" Magneto glanced at the fishing rod, a flicker of amusement at the absurdity of someone who dodged responsibility being so powerful. He explained. Months earlier, after helping Charles restore Cerebro, the mind-amplifying device, Magneto had left the Mutant Academy. He disagreed with the Academy's approach and chose to take a different path, to gather mutant brothers, fight for their rights, and, if necessary, to make some people pay. Where Shufu preferred restraint, Magneto was ruthless. He'd also gathered important intelligence. According to S.H.I.E.L.D. reports, there was a small African country that harbored a large number of mutants. The rulers there, however, were not mutants. They were ordinary humans who held power and treated mutants like slaves. Magneto had come to find and rally those oppressed mutants. Shufu listened, absorbing the situation. Hundreds of mutants, oppressed and scattered. Magneto's presence here explained the ragged procession on the beach. Chapter 102, Section 102. Magneto was stunned when he first learned of Genosha. Furious, he traveled straight to that country and found the situation far worse than his intelligence had indicated. On the surface, Genosha was prosperous, more advanced than many developed nations. It did not look like an ordinary African state at all. But that prosperity was built entirely on the exploitation and enslavement of mutants. Mutants were identified by machines at birth, processed, and brainwashed into servitude. A strict secrecy regime kept people trapped inside the country, unable to leave, while special enforcement teams hunted down anyone who tried to escape. It was a slave state, cloaked in modern civilization. Magneto was enraged and launched an offensive. The rulers of Genosha were equally ruthless. They fielded mutant conscripts to fight for them. Magneto, reluctant to endanger those he was trying to free, held back from all-out destruction and fought a guerrilla war instead. The ragged people he pulled out were the mutants he'd rescued. Shufu listened in disbelief. The Marvel Universe truly was a strange place. Anything could exist here. There was even a nation like this. He felt some relief, too. After all, Wakanda still clung to its tribal structures, even though it mastered energy shields. Strange things fit the land. "What are you going to do?" Shufu asked Eric. "Rescue our people," Magneto answered. "This should be our land. We can't allow them to be enslaved." He looked at Shufu. "Join us. With your power, we could easily free more of them. Mutants should unite." Shufu curled one lip. He didn't feel like a mutant, and he had no desire to follow Magneto and play hero. "No interest," he replied flatly. "You can do it yourself. I won't get involved." Magneto didn't force him when he refused, but his request immediately changed tone. "Can you at least send them to a nearby island? I need somewhere to put them while I continue the fight." "That I can do," Shufu said. It wouldn't bother him. He would do the easy thing. Maybe someday these mutants could be useful to him. It was unnecessary to be ruthless about everything. Shufu extended his hand. A golden portal opened, and the exhausted refugees gasped as if seeing a miracle. Even after witnessing many uncanny abilities, they had never expected this. The portal led to a small island with clear signs of human habitation. Magneto exhaled in relief. "Thank you," he said sincerely, bowing. "Our people will never forget you." Shufu waved him off and left without further comment. Magneto led the refugees through the portal. For the next fortnight, Magneto attacked the regime again and again, each time dragging more mutants out of Genosha. Shufu watched from afar and occasionally opened a portal to receive them. The numbers were staggering. Tens of thousands had been freed so far. According to Magneto, the ones he'd rescued were less than 1,000th of Genosha's total. If that was true, this small African nation sheltered tens of millions of mutants, a fact that shocked Shufu and suggested something profoundly abnormal was happening. But Shufu preferred not to waste his time chasing anomalies. He spent his days fishing and watching movies, enjoying a rare peace. He didn't realize that Magneto's campaign had set the world on edge. News of the raid spread fast. Magneto was already #1 on many countries' most wanted lists, a villain in the eyes of governments, while Genosha's rulers had long masked their atrocities in international forums. To outsiders, Genosha had been an insignificant backward state. Now the world watched as its self-proclaimed terrorist invaded and extracted swaths of population. The United Nations dispatched investigators, and anti-mutant factions seized the opportunity to inflame tensions. The atmosphere turned volatile almost overnight. But Magneto was not the kind of man who cared for diplomatic opinion. He had once tried to strike at the world's political leaders while the United Nations convened. Would he be swayed now by embroiled debates and condemnations? Chapter 103, Section 103. He didn't hold back. He rallied the mutants and launched a full-scale offensive. Magneto is an incredibly charismatic leader. Even many of the villains who'd opposed him felt a deep respect for the man. For mutants, Magneto was born to lead. Under his direction, the mutants in Genosha rose in rebellion. Mutant power is formidable by nature. Once the mind control over them was lifted, they became a force of nature. With Magneto, a powerhouse in his own right, coordinating from the sidelines, Genosha's military forces faltered. In less than 2 months, they were routed and scattered. Magneto then moved to establish a regime for the mutants. "So, are you a king now? A president?" Shufu watched the animated Magneto and asked. "Heh, I'm just building a home for our people," Magneto answered with earnest sincerity. He could have joined the World's Security Council or accepted rulership in some small nation, and no one would have batted an eye. But for the sake of his people, He'd stood up to the Council and its member states. Magneto's devotion to mutants was unquestionable. That devotion is what made him a villain to some, but also so compelling. He was a protector of a people. Then your goal's already achieved, Shu Fu said. Magneto shifted, his expression growing serious. Why are you here? I've taken most of Genosha. I'm effectively in charge. What brings you to me, Wanderer? I'm worried, Magneto admitted. The World Security Council's recent moves aren't right. They're planning something. I need information. I need your help. Shu Fu frowned. Don't you have your own intelligence network? He didn't sound inclined to help. He could have had Nick Fury pull strings for intel, but that would cost favors, and Shu Fu wasn't willing to spend them for Magneto. Seeing the hesitation, Magneto tried another tack. This concerns you to a degree. You might not care, but you're effectively part of the mutant cause now. Don't drag me into this, Shu Fu said, perplexed. He hadn't considered himself part of any mutant ranks. Magneto nodded and went blunt. You're too strong. You make our mutants too dangerous, and that's a threat to the governments out there. If Shu Fu didn't exist, Magneto ruling Genosha might have been an annoyance the world would reluctantly accept. A small, out-of-the-way country in Africa is hardly worth confronting. But Shu Fu's presence changed everything. He was like a small nation suddenly possessing nuclear weapons, a single person with world-altering power. The great powers couldn't ignore that. Shu Fu alone was terrifying. With a country backing him, the situation became intolerable to those who held power. Magneto hadn't realized this at first. He only learned it after capturing a high-ranking official and reading his mind. After hearing Magneto's explanation, Shu Fu curled a lip. He'd long expected the major powers, the World Security Council, Shield, and others, to fear and target him. In a world where expansion was impossible and everyone scrapped for what little they had, any rising power would draw attention and hostility. Wakanda hid its technological edge precisely to avoid that spotlight. The strong preyed on the weak. Survival meant staying invisible. But Shu Fu wasn't the sort to bow to that logic. He had absolute confidence in his power. If others wanted trouble, he was ready. After a long pause, Shu Fu shrugged and sat down on a stool. All right, I want to see what kind of tricks they try. You don't understand. This is too dangerous for you, Magneto warned, frowning. Let them come. Shu Fu said, calm and unbothered. You think too highly of the World Security Council. They probably can't even take care of themselves. Still want to deal with me? Shu Fu smiled with contempt. On the whole Earth, the only beings who could threaten him were the Ancient One and those gods who had disappeared long ago. The gods no longer acted recklessly, and the Ancient One was not unreasonable. As long as Shu Fu didn't commit racial genocide or pose an existential threat to human civilization, the Ancient One would leave him be. You have sacrificed too much for your people, Magneto said, earnest. We will remember what you've done. You will be our savior. I have no interest in being anyone's savior, Shu Fu replied. Just don't cause me trouble. He waved Magneto off. Magneto nodded and turned to leave. Shu Fu ignored him and went back to fishing. The World Security Council? What could they do? They were politicians. If they were truly capable, they wouldn't have needed the Avengers when Thanos invaded. Shu Fu knew the Council's secrets and didn't take them seriously. For Magneto, however, the World Security Council was a leviathan. After returning to Genosha, he accelerated his plans for governance. He even brought Charles Xavier to help. Though their methods differed, they shared the same goal, to save mutants. One Magneto had been formidable. With Charles added, Genosha's defenses became almost impregnable. Under those circumstances, frightened rulers fled to the United Nations to complain. The World Security Council finally had an excuse. This is a provocation. A blatant invasion of a sovereign state is an affront to our dignity. We must impose severe sanctions. Counselor Gideon Malik spoke gravely. Malik came from an ancient lineage whose roots could be traced back millennia. He had held high defense posts, been a counselor, and occupied many powerful positions. Now he was one of the most influential figures on the council, and more importantly, he had another, darker identity. He was a veteran of Hydra. His family had been one of Hydra's founding houses, and within Hydra, he held considerable sway. Even the likes of Pierce were juniors compared to him. Unlike many who had joined Hydra for power, Malik's loyalty had a specific, older purpose: to fulfill his family's mission of bringing back the powerful hive from ancient times, the legendary master of Hydra. The original aim of Hydra had been to find that master and seize its power. Later, ambitious figures joined and twisted the organization into a global conspiracy bent on domination. Malik's push for sanctions against Magneto's Genosha was not driven by noble ideals or genuine concern for international law. He wanted mutants and the power they represented. Hydra's research into mutant abilities had advanced far. A company run by a man nicknamed Snake had even produced a serum that could turn ordinary people into superpowered beings and lengthen life. The serum was unstable and dangerous, but the promise of power and longevity was irresistible to a powerful, aging official. Malik could not risk becoming the first guinea pig. He needed test subjects, lots of them, and the largest concentration of mutants on Earth lived in Genosha. That was why he and his allies were pushing so hard for sanctions, even proposing to erase Genosha and seize its population for experimentation. Yet Malik did not have unilateral control over the council. Dissent arose quickly. "I disagree," one counselor said. "We have to weigh costs and benefits. Mutants are dangerous, yes, but they aren't weak. If we sanction and then attack, who will enforce it? Genosha isn't an ordinary country. Economic sanctions won't work." This counselor pointed out the practical problems. Genosha was highly self-sufficient and didn't rely on the international system. Many standard levers of pressure would be useless. Malik's rhetoric suggested he wanted military measures. A few condemnatory statements would appease his vanity, but real action would require clear benefits, and none of the council members liked risking their own interests for someone else's vendetta. Most nations were not as hostile to mutants as the United States, whose loudest anti-mutant rhetoric came from its position of power. Malik had deep ties to the U.S., had held senior defense and advisory roles, and wielded influence in business circles. But he knew his colleagues well. They could be coaxed into statements and votes, but asking them to sacrifice tangible benefits or risk military confrontation was a different matter. They would not be fooled. "Everyone, listen," Malik pleaded, trying to regain control of the room. Chapter 105, Section 105. "Since I brought it up, of course I have a plan," Gillian said. "We can deal with this entirely. You only need to agree to sanction them. In return, I'll release some of our research data on the Chitauri." At the mention of Chitauri research, every delegate in the World Security Council leaned forward. The Chitauri invasion of New York had been a disaster for the city, but their technology and materials were invaluable to Earth scientists. No one felt they couldn't use more of that kind of thing. Countries and corporations had been trying, mostly in vain, to obtain Chitauri samples and data. If Gillian was offering access to it, that alone could sway many of the council members. They were, after all, representatives of powerful interests. Moralizing rhetoric mattered little when national and corporate advantages were on the line. Gillian had come prepared with a reward substantial enough to erase most objections. After a moment of consideration, the other members nodded. "In that case, we have no objections," one said. Gillian allowed himself a pleased smile. "That's the pragmatic way to do things. Thank you for your support." He felt triumphant. In his view, ethics were a luxury adults couldn't afford when real interests were at stake. Just then, a representative, whom everyone called the Dragon Country, spoke up. If there was a delegation that still tried to make decisions on principle, it was theirs. They had been the only voice of caution earlier. "Gillian, we don't object to action, but you're not going to mobilize the Avengers, are you? Do you have any other special operatives lined up?" The room watched Gillian for an answer. The Avengers were widely seen as independent champions of justice. Few believed they would participate in what could easily look like an attack aimed at an entire people. Gillian's lips curled into a smile. "You're right," he said. "The Avengers belong to history now. The United States has a new kind of superhero." He tapped the screen. A blonde figure filled the projection, broad-shouldered, square-jawed, eyes set hard under a heavy brow. He wore the stars and stripes like a cloak. The silence in the room tightened. This looked like a very different kind of American hero. "Allow me to introduce the superhero cultivated by Vought Corporation," Gillian announced. "Homelander." Murmurs ran through the chamber. Jillian clapped, feeding the spectacle. This is a hero Vought has raised since childhood, a superhuman. He will represent the nation and restore humanity's glory. Vought Corporation was not the most powerful industrial juggernaut on the planet, far from it compared to Stark Industries or even Hammer, but it had a unique specialty. While other firms produced ordinary pharmaceuticals, Vought developed humans. Their research focused on creating and controlling superpowered beings. Those altered by their formulas were the company's property. It hadn't been an easy road. Decades ago, when the U.S. recruited scores of German scientists, Vought acquired classified research and techniques that put them on the right track. They'd also discovered mutants, humans born with extraordinary abilities, and began a long process of studying and, in many cases, replicating those powers. From those blood-soaked experiments and reverse engineering came Compound Vive, the formula Vought used to manufacture powered individuals. Homelander was the pinnacle of that work, strength and hearing rivaling any Superman myth, flight, and the terrifying ability to emit concentrated beams from his eyes. To Vought, he was the perfect product. The company planned to turn Homelander and its other assets into a sanctioned, marketable force, their own version of the Avengers, and profit from movies, merchandise, endorsements, and the cultural dominance that came with being the face of national security. Jillian, who had long used Vought as a Hydra-affiliated instrument, was thoroughly satisfied. With his endorsement and with the promise of access to Chitauri materials dangling like a bribe, the Council's resistance evaporated. One by one, they nodded, and the World Security Council agreed to Jillian's proposal to take action against the mutant nation. In this world, few could stop what was coming, not even Nick Fury, director of S.H.I.E.L.D. By the time Fury managed to warn the Mutant Academy, the World Security Council's orders had already been passed to Vought Corporation. Even Stan Edgar, the man who ran Vought, had to obey orders from above. He didn't resent it so much as seize the opportunity. Jillian's confession had given Vought the opening it needed to take the next step. With a faint excitement, Edgar walked into the building. From beyond the conference room door came a furious, pounding voice. "I don't want to do this. This isn't me. I'm not like those people. I'm not trash." Edgar didn't need to look to know who it was. Homelander, Vought's most perfect product, was inside. He pushed the door open and stepped into the room. Homelander stood with his assistant, glaring. His face was shadowed with a dangerous, stormy look far removed from the heroic image the company sold the public. Seeing Edgar, he forced a smile and composed himself. "Edgar," Homelander said. Edgar returned none of the warmth. "You can act out in the company, Homelander. Outside, you must keep your image. The company is building you into a team, an Avengers-level group. We cannot have any damaging news. You understand?" Homelander, for all his bluster, craved adoration. Underneath the arrogant, volatile surface was a core need to be worshipped and needed, something Edgar knew how to exploit. Hearing that he would be presented as a world-saving hero made Homelander light up. "Of course I understand," he said, smiling brightly. Edgar's face remained flat. "There's one more thing I need from you. If you do this, you'll have the backing of a lot of important people," Edgar went on. "Your actions will be justified. Good for Vought. Do you understand?" Homelander smiled, eager. "Is it about taking out terrorists and petty criminals? I can handle that." Edgar's expression changed. "This time it's different. The enemies are different. They have powers. They are mutants." "Mutants," Homelander scoffed. "They're defective products. They can't even control their own abilities. Why should they compare to me?" He looked down his nose at the idea. Homelander had been raised inside Vought's walls, observed and shaped from childhood. Edgar had been one of the people closest to him, and so Homelander's view of mutants was simplistic. Edgar knew more, but chose what to reveal carefully. "You're the best we've got," Edgar said softly as he patted Homelander's shoulder, the words wrapped in that corporate tone that meant a person was a prized asset. "But you're our most valuable asset. Protect yourself. Don't take unnecessary risks." The naive part of Homelander took the compliment at face value. "When do I leave?" "Whenever you're ready," Edgar said. "This is a righteous mission. You won't have to worry about consequences. Those mutants are world destroyers. There will be no apologies for dealing with them." Very good, Homelander said, pleased. Under Homelander's agreement, Edgar set things in motion and chose the first target. Jillian's confession had not been about seizing power for a ruler of Genosha. His true aim was to gather specimens and materials. Publicly, of course, those behind the operation would frame it as rescuing Genosha and freeing mutants who had been brainwashed by criminals, another righteous, moral cause. Vought would position Homelander as the savior, then round up the mutants and ship them to the company's labs. It was business as usual for Vought. People were resources. They would harvest whatever they could, with no illusions about ethics. It didn't take long for Edgar to marshal Vought's influence. Genosha might be a small country, but it was no backwater. Magneto had rallied many mutants and held the upper hand in much of the country, but even he could not be everywhere at once. There were still pockets of resistance and regions outside his direct control, mutants who worked to reclaim land and rescue their brainwashed kin. Chapter 107, Section 107. The incident presented Vought Corporation with an ideal opportunity. Backed by the World Security Council, Vought's intelligence apparatus was formidable. They soon pinpointed a small town about to be attacked and sent Vought special forces to lie in wait. Homelander was ready from above. The mutants aligned with Magneto had no idea they were walking into a trap. A team of several dozen drove into town, determined to liberate it and rescue their brainwashed compatriots. Their leader was Laurelie, whose ultrasonic powers could paralyze people, a perfect ability for pulling victims out of mind control. That talent had earned her the leadership of the team. According to our intel, the garrison is weak, Laurelie said. You go in and free our people. She led the charge. When armed men rushed up with rifles, Laurelie raised her hand and sent out an invisible, paralyzing wave. The gunmen hit the ground instantly. The mutants behind her moved in to bind and secure them. They advanced triumphantly. They could taste victory. Then a figure fell from the sky, cape patterned like a national flag streaming behind him. He landed with his hands clasped behind his back and a bright, theatrical smile, as if standing in his own garden rather than on a battlefield. Don't be afraid. I am Homelander, he called, smiling toward the terrified soldiers and civilians. I'm here to save you. Laurelie froze for a beat. What are you? She shouted. I am the symbol of freedom and justice, Homelander announced, striking a perfectly posed angle for the hidden camera crew. I am Homelander. He turned to Laurelie. You damn terrorists are destroying a peaceful world. Laurelie didn't wait. She unleashed her ultrasonic blast at once. It struck Homelander full in the chest. He glanced down as if politely noticing it, but didn't even flinch. A smile widened across his face, then his eyes flashed red. What followed was carnage. Homelander's powers might be a toned-down echo of Superman's, but they were still devastating. Mutants who could have resisted many opponents were powerless before him. One of Laurelie's fighters was vaporized in an instant. The rest crumpled to their knees and surrendered. Homelander looked over the fallen with relish, then at the camera crew behind him. I am Homelander, he intoned for the cameras. I will protect everyone. He shot upward and vanished into the sky. Vought operatives moved in immediately, sweeping the scene. They hauled everyone away, alive or dead, treating the captured mutants no differently than the lab animals they'd confiscated. News of Vought's brutality spread through the mutant community like wildfire. Magneto personally intervened, but Vought had been cunning, exploiting its alliance with the World Security Council to wage hit-and-run operations. They struck mutant settlements repeatedly, stealing resources and prisoners. In a matter of months, they had taken tens of thousands of mutants. Magneto seethed, but direct retaliation was impossible. He turned to Shufu for help. Magneto wasn't asking Shufu to lead attacks. He wanted infrastructure, a portal network. With a stable network and help from a few teleport-capable mutants, Magneto could ensure rapid reinforcement across the mutant territories. Who attacked you? Shufu asked. Which nation sent them? The United States has fully mobilized? Magneto snorted. It's not a country. It's a company. Vought Corporation, he spat. They have fewer scruples than many nations. They act like executioners. Shufu's expression changed. Vought, don't tell me they have a Homelander. How do you know the name? The man who attacked the mutants called himself Homelander. Magneto scowled. He's a mutant aligned with humans. Disgusting. Shufu's brow lifted. Of all the worlds, this one was full of bizarre crossovers. Gods and champions from other realities had already shown up here, a familiar face among Vought's ranks, while Odd didn't surprise him. Still, he didn't relish being dragged into another political struggle. For the professor's sake, I'll help you one more time, Shufu said. But don't bother me after this. It was a small thing for him to do. He disliked trouble more than he feared power, and he intended this to be the last time he intervened. Chapter 108, Section 108, No Problem. Magneto nodded once. Shufu waved his hand, and a flash of golden light appeared. Metal coalesced in his palm, shifting and folding until it became a metal door engraved with strange, arcane patterns, the same kind of door used in the Kamar-Taj temple to open a portal to the world. If you had a node recorded at a fixed location, opening a portal became effortless. Both Kamar-Taj and Nabu preserved alchemical traditions. For Shufu, forging this was little more than refining an ore. When the light faded, he tossed the door to Magneto and recited the precautions. Then he turned back to his fishing, as if that settled everything. Magneto inclined his head in thanks and left. Using the portal gave Magneto a decisive advantage against Vought. With it, they could reinforce any threatened location instantly. When Vought struck, mutants could be evacuated or bolstered in minutes. Homelander, like any single super, couldn't be everywhere at once. Vought's campaigns, however, were relentless and ruthless. They simply had no scruples. That lack of restraint let them escalate conflicts to the point where the mutants, led by Magneto and Charles, increasingly found themselves at a disadvantage. It wasn't that the mutants lacked power. It was that Vought trafficked in terror, including targeting civilians to force compliance. Magneto held back because he refused to massacre innocents, and Charles, tempted to use Cerebro to eliminate Vought's leadership outright, restrained himself as well, fearing catastrophic fallout if the outside world learned of such an atrocity. Those constraints made Vought bolder. Edgar ordered Homelander to hit a major mutant base in Genosha. In a place like that, Homelander was in his element. He descended into the small city with cameras and Vought personnel in tow, planting himself squarely in front of the mutant stronghold, giving interviews and grinning for the lenses as if the whole thing were a show. "I am Homelander," he boomed, "protector of human peace. All injustice will vanish before me." Mutant defenders opened fire from the compound. Genosha's population wasn't all mutants. Charles had led efforts to protect civilians and keep them under mutant governance, and the human soldiers in the ranks now did their part. Rifles barked, bullets swept toward Homelander. Ding, ding, ding. Shots pinged off him and clattered to the ground, deformed but leaving his skin untouched. Even heavy machine gun rounds, 20mm shells that would shred flesh and concrete, bounced harmlessly off his body. "I am Homelander," he shouted again to the cameras, "America's greatest hero." Realizing small arms were useless, the defenders brought out tanks. Though the Genoshan armor was old, they had been supplied modern depleted uranium armor-piercing rounds purchased from abroad. These rounds could penetrate half a meter of homogeneous armor and unleash temperatures up to 6,000 degrees Celsius on impact, enough to vaporize ordinary targets. A tank's concealed main gun lined up. The APFSDS round, a tungsten core with an initial velocity of about 1,600 meters per second, launched and struck Homelander's chest. Depleted uranium ignited under the kinetic stress, and a furnace of 6,000 degrees flared against him. For any human, that would have been instant vaporization. Homelander's battlesuit took the brunt. The upper half of the suit shredded and burned away, but his skin remained unmarked. The kinetic punch and the blistering heat left no trace on him. He merely flexed and glared angrily at the compound. For a moment, the mutants cheered, convinced they'd mortally wounded him. Their celebration didn't last long. 2 searing red beams lanced out from Homelander, raw, hateful power condensed into light. The tank's turret and hull disintegrated in a heartbeat, melting into molten scrap. The crew barely had time to react before they were reduced to charred remnants. The twin beams swept across the compound, tearing reinforced concrete as if it were paper. Soldiers and mutants alike were sliced and incinerated where they stood. "Why won't he die?" someone screamed. "It's a monster! He's a monster!" cried another. "Help! It's burning me! Please, someone help!" In seconds, the plaza became an inferno. Screams and the stench of burning flesh filled the air. What had been a defensive stand had turned into a slaughter. Genosha's streets transformed into a hell on earth. Chapter 109. Section 109. Homelander's heat vision was terrifyingly concentrated, so dense its beams seemed to contain energy of their own. He could slice a person clean in two at the waist, and the halves might twitch and cling to life for a little while before death took them. It was a specially cruel kind of torment. The city was filled with miserable screams. Blood and the smell of burned flesh hung heavy in the air. Homelander ignored every cry. Anger hardened his face, and the red glow in his eyes never stopped. He had long since abandoned any pretense of being a hero. He had become an executioner. Wherever his gaze landed, people were torn apart. When a madman stopped concealing his power, the result was nothing short of a disaster for ordinary humans. Even mutants, powerful in their own right, could do little before Homelander and were reduced to being executed. Those who tried to flee could not avoid the Flying Man. Homelander alone slaughtered this town, and anyone who could resist was killed. Limbs and bones littered the streets. Blood flowed in rivulets. It was hell made real. When Magneto and Charles arrived through a portal, they found that scene of carnage. Magneto's eyes flared red and his fists clenched until his knuckles cracked. Metal nearby lifted into the air, responding to his rage as his control wavered. He hadn't felt like this in years. Angry, powerless, watching his people die and feeling his own ability spiral out of control. Within a 10-kilometer radius, metal warped and groaned. "Calm down," Charles said sharply. He reached out with his mind and steadied Eric, guiding him back from the brink. "Eric, what we need to do now is rescue our people, not vent our anger." Magneto's breathing slowed. He forced his powers back into leash and nodded. "You're right. We have to save them." The expression on his face sharpened and alive with purpose. Magneto took command, rallying the mutants around him. Using their powers, they searched the ruins, calling to survivors and pulling the injured to safety. Destruction was always easier than rebuilding. Homelander's wanton massacre had taken minutes, but healing its damage would take them a long time. Every mutant's heart swelled with grief and rage, but they had work to do. This, however, was only one episode in a wider pattern. Homelander could not be called a hero in any meaningful sense. Perhaps at first he had come to Genosha to carry out Vought Corporation's orders, but after a few missions, he became intoxicated with the place. He preferred the worship and fear his power brought to any talk of heroism. The more reckless he grew, the more he was encouraged by Vought and by the World Security Council that backed them. Genosha's old rulers clandestinely supported him, inciting ordinary people and even some mutants to join a rebellion and fight against their own. The country slid into chaos. The World Security Council may have been the main architect, but Vought and Homelander were the hands that executed the plan, and Homelander was clearly addicted to it. Back at the company, it didn't take long for him to pick another target. "Homelander, shouldn't we wait a bit?" his assistant asked nervously. "The mutants have been especially vigilant lately. Several of our teams were attacked." Homelander smiled, amusement and menace in equal measure. "Are you saying I'm no match for a few so-called mutants?" "No, of course not," she stammered, a chill running down her spine. She knew Homelander well enough to know the danger of answering him wrong. "What I mean is that you've been very busy. Maybe you should rest for a while. You're working so hard for the company." "No need." His smile widened. "It's our responsibility to take risks for the company. Pick a target and I'll act immediately." He leaned back with his feet on the table, hands behind his head, giving orders like an emperor. No one dared object. The staff selected a target and the team deployed. This time, they chose a military base the mutants had abandoned during the retreat. The base had been intended as a training ground, a seed for a professional mutant army. Magneto hoped to build to defend their people. He couldn't protect everyone forever, and the base was an obvious strategic asset. Vought circled it on their list. Vought had learned from experience. With backing from the World Security Council and advanced technology at their disposal, they blocked all external communications from the base before Homelander moved in. Then they staged it, Homelander killed a few people on camera to establish the narrative, planted witnesses and actors to justify his actions, and struck without mercy. The attack was brutal. The campers had little ability to resist. Only a few instructors were able to mount anything resembling a defense. One was Oleg, a tall man who could transform his body into any substance he had touched. Another, Lane, summoned a fiery whip and lashed out. "Homelander, you madman," one of them screamed. "You executioner. One day everyone will turn on you," Lane shouted, his whip cracking through the smoky air. Chapter 110, Section 110. Oleg shouted at the top of his lungs and turned his body into diamond, using the crystalline shell to block Homelander's strike. Homelander's face, however, only twisted into the expression of a predator toying with its prey. He vanished and reappeared like a phantom directly in front of Oleg, delivering a single kick that sent him sprawling. Homelander planted one boot on Oleg's chest, put his other hand to his ear, and exaggeratedly shouted, "What did you say? I can't hear you. Louder!" Pinned beneath Homelander's foot, Oleg writhed in pain but couldn't fight back. Homelander's power was overwhelming. "You madman," Oleg managed. "One day, sooner or later, you'll die in someone else's hands, just like Liu Yai." Oleg spat, his curses failing to land. Homelander laughed, a wild, triumphant sound. "Delusions. Pathetic. You'll be lying here on the ground forever," he sneered. "Your curses mean nothing." "Under the company's publicity, I'll become the world's greatest hero," Oleg gasped. "And you're just terrorists." Triumph lit Homelander's eyes. He looked down at the glittering form under his boot. "Your body is diamond? Let's see how well that holds up." He slammed his foot down with brutal force. Crack! Oleg's diamond body shattered like glass. Even the hardest substance has a breaking point. Homelander glanced with contempt at the scattered fragments and with a glare, burned Ryan with a flash of red light, then turned and dusted off his clothes with disdain. He left the scene accompanied by his film crew. By the time Magneto and the others arrived, it was too late. Bodies littered the area. Those mutants still alive had been rounded up and taken away. Magneto and the rest could only stare in helpless rage. Worse, Vought had already spun the massacre as an act of justice. The executioner, Homelander, had been framed as a hero. The mutants were the villains. The captured mutants were presented as the very civilians Vought had rescued. When Magneto saw the televised report, he was barely contained fury. "Charles," he barked. "Don't you see? They want us dead," he continued, voice raw. "They want to exterminate us. They couldn't have done this without those people's backing. This is war. This is genocide." Charles Xavier's face was a mixture of helplessness, anger, and sorrow. "If they want war, we'll give them war," he said quietly. "We declare war on Vought Corporation across the board. Either they die, or we perish." Magneto's teeth were clenched. His words were stained with blood and tears. A tabloid-style headline blared across screens the next day. Chapter 71, 2 Mutant Leaders Fight Homelander. Miserable defeat? Subscription requested. Once the 2 mutant leaders reached an accord, resistance was no longer the problem. Coordination was. News of the declaration spread fast. Mutants, though varied in strength, possessed strange and devastating abilities. When they targeted a person or a corporation, the damage could be severe. In just 1 week, Vought reeled under assaults, hundreds killed in suicide strikes, including several executives. Many of those attackers had been hidden mutants striking together, united by shared hatred. Edgar, meanwhile, had already secured his gains and quietly halted the operation in Genosha. His priority was profit, not a scorched earth battle to the death. If a mutant caused trouble for him, his plan was to erase traces and shift the blame. What he hadn't counted on was Homelander's refusal to step back. Homelander returned from Genosha intoxicated with adulation and bloodlust. He stormed straight into Edgar's office and demanded an explanation. "Why did I retreat? Why did we stop the operation?" His face was flat, his eyes dark with menace, so much so that the air itself seemed to bristle. Edgar met him without fear. If there was one person in Vought who did not tremble before Homelander, it was Edgar, the man who had groomed him, the architect behind the scenes. He had no reverence for the living weapon he'd helped create and spoke to him with frankness bordering on contempt. "The company ordered you back," Edgar said coldly. "There are reasons." Homelander's gaze sharpened. "What reasons?" he demanded. "I need an explanation." "We have discovered something unusual about the mutants," Edgar said without expression. "He has recently concentrated all his efforts on attacking the company, and the company has suffered great losses," another voice added. "This is a situation that I, and most of the shareholders, do not want to see." Edgar pushed his gold-rimmed glasses up the bridge of his nose. "Shareholders? Just that bunch of fat cats. What right do they have?" Homelander spat. "They're nothing. I could easily kill them," he went on. "If it weren't for you, I would have wiped out that country long ago." Homelander's voice rose. "You'd better show me some respect." "You don't have that strength," Edgar said flatly. "The leader of the mutants, Magneto, still possesses tremendous power. Even you won't find him easy to handle. The company needs a complete plan." Homelander sneered. "I don't believe it. In this world, no one is stronger than me. Magneto, he's an old man. If he stood in front of me, I'd kill him without effort." His arrogance came from unshakable confidence. Though a toned-down version of Superman, Homelander's ceiling was still far beyond a normal superhuman's. He had never been injured, had never felt anything like a real threat. What for anyone else might be fatal was to him like a mosquito bite. He looked at the aging Magneto with contempt. Edgar met him calmly. "Ignorance," he said. "Your arrogance will kill you sooner or later. Now leave. If the company wants you to act, you'll be notified." Homelander's scowl deepened, but Edgar's face stayed placid. He reached for his work and ignored him. Furious, Homelander slammed his hand down, shattering Edgar's desk, then turned and stalked from the office. "Heh! Superhero," Edgar muttered as he wiped his glasses. "A giant baby." Homelander heard it. One of his powers was an almost preternatural awareness. He could pick up insults uttered about him even behind his back. Anger flared. He punched through the office wall until his fist left a hole. "Old man," he hissed under his breath. "If you won't let me go, I'll go anyway. I want to see if Magneto is really that strong. Old things like him are going to die. Sooner or later, I'll kill all of you old things." He forced his features back into a sunny smile, flicked his cape, and flew over to the company's intelligence department as if nothing had happened. The department chief was a broad, resolute black man with a calm presence. Seeing Homelander approach, he rose and smiled. "Homelander, what brings you here?" "Is there anything you can tell me about Magneto?" Homelander asked bluntly. "This is company top secret. I need approval," the chief began. "I said I want intelligence on Magneto," Homelander interrupted. He didn't bother to hide his impatience. He stepped forward. His stare pinned the man in place. The chief swallowed. A red glow flared briefly in Homelander's eyes. "I'll go find it for you right away," he said, easing his tone. "With your authority, you can access those files." Relief washed over the man like cold water. Survive first, shame later. He moved quickly, all his nervousness masked by forced competence. Homelander's threatening expression melted into a bright smile as soon as the tablet was passed into his hands. "We're all the company," Homelander said, clapping the chief on the shoulder. "This shouldn't go any further." The man nodded, knees weak, sweat beading on his forehead. "Don't worry. Absolutely no one else will know." He handed over the tablet. Homelander tucked it under his arm and left. Once the door shut behind him, the chief sank into his chair, shaken. Now he understood why everyone who worked with Homelander stayed so frightened. He was volatile, and he truly had the power to end you if he chose. Outside, Homelander hovered for a moment. Then, without wasting time, he took off. As he cut through the sky, he opened the tablet and began reading the intelligence on Magneto. Chapter 112, Section 112. Inside the tablet were videos and photos of Magneto in action. "Indeed, it's a very magical power," someone muttered. "But Magneto, heh." Homelander's lip curled into a contemptuous smile. He flung his hand out and tossed the tablet away. His eyes flared red, and the device turned to ash midair. For ordinary people, Magneto was terrifying, but to Homelander, he was little more than an annoyance. At his peak, Homelander could move the Golden Gate Bridge, and he had done things like that before. "Old man," he said softly, "let me show you what real power looks like." He had no patience for Edgar's tactics. Homelander rocketed into the sky like a meteor. It didn't take long for him to cross to Genosha. Using the intel he'd acquired, he located the likely stronghold where Magneto was hiding. Without hesitation, he unleashed his sight, twin beams of searing red, and rained death down. The ground became a sea of fire. Mutants who hadn't even had time to react were burned alive. Homelander listened to the screams with a blank face and felt only a strange satisfaction as his heat vision intensified. There was a reason Vought called him their cornerstone. His powers were immense, and he commanded them with absolute precision. Even in a rage, his abilities did not run wild. His control was clinical. Far stronger than most mutants, he let loose everything, becoming a living turret of concentrated firepower, annihilating everything beneath him. People simply turned into torches with a glance. Mutants who tried to rise up and fight found they couldn't even touch him. "This is what you call mutants? A bunch of weaklings," he scoffed, voice echoing across the night. "No one can stop me." Homelander's laughter split the sky as the red light bathed the city. The laser beams seemed inexhaustible, his power boundless. The entire city turned to flames. "You madman!" A voice suddenly whispered in his mind. Homelander faltered, his body wavering in midair, but he steadied himself within a heartbeat. "Get out of my head!" he snapped. His face contorted as he fought something unseen. Mental powers were Homelander's one real vulnerability. Physically, he was a colossus, and that raw strength had forged a will to match. He could manipulate his powers flawlessly. His inner resilience stopped most invasions. Still, the intrusion was real. It felt like telepathy. He snarled and pushed back with everything he had. Charles's presence was flung from his mind. Professor X's attempt to control him collapsed like a struck reed. When faced with foes weaker than him, Charles could be a god. Against someone who could resist, he'd been made helpless and embarrassed. At that moment, Magneto rose. He floated up on a shield of metal, an impossibly vast curtain that stretched for thousands of meters, metal twisting and multiplying until it seemed to cover sky and earth. Magneto's hatred for Homelander was plain as he spoke, fury ringing in his voice. "Homelander, you will pay for what you have done." Under his command, the metals congealed into two enormous black torrents, like twin steel dragons, bearing down on Homelander with terrible force. Homelander glanced down at Magneto with pure disdain. In the world of the boys, he might not have been the absolute strongest, but this was the Marvel universe. The Vought serum, spliced with mutant DNA, meant Homelander now carried an X gene, in effect a hybrid mutant. Marvel's mutants were monstrously powerful. Apart from the one above all, few showed mercy. The top tier could reshape realities and toy with time. Homelander was nowhere near that, but even a fraction of that strength would overwhelm Magneto. And more importantly, Homelander's raw energy output was on a different scale. He didn't bother with restraint. Twin beams of red sliced from his eyes, unleashed at full output. The metal torrent heated nearly instantly, the particles glowing white-hot, melting into rivers of molten metal that rained down. Once liquefied, Magneto's control faltered. Liquid metal is harder to manipulate at that temperature. Homelander dove and closed the distance in a heartbeat. Magneto's face went pale. He threw up a metallic barrier, but Homelander's hand met it and punched through as if it were foam. The fist shattered steel and tore through the protective lattice. His punch connected with Magneto's chest. A spurt of blood sprayed from the older man's mouth. He lost his concentration and began to fall from the sky. Magneto's power was terrifying when it worked, but his physical frame and reaction speed were only marginally above a normal human's. Against Homelander's speed and strength, he simply couldn't react. Homelander yanked his arm free from the shattered metal and looked down at the fallen Titan with undisguised contempt. "You two old men, the strongest mutants?" he mocked. "The mutant race is nothing more than this. You exist in this world without any meaning. You should just die." Homelander spoke without mercy, wasting no words. Red light flared in his eyes. He moved to kill Magneto outright. Professor X reacted first. He activated the portal Shufu had given him and dragged Magneto through it. Homelander was powerful, but he couldn't rend space with his bare hands, and his speed had limits. He couldn't follow. He watched the two fleeing like wounded dogs for a moment, sneered, and shot up into the sky. For Magneto and Charles, the situation was grim. Magneto had taken that punch from Homelander hard. He was physically battered, and his spirit was scattered. Worse, his pride lay in pieces. Against Homelander, his powers had counted for nothing. It wasn't simply a gap in raw strength. The problem was the stakes. No matter how formidable a mutant, one clean strike from an assassin could end them. Homelander could afford many mistakes. Magneto couldn't afford even one. That single fatal vulnerability had been exposed, and Magneto had been crushed by the consequences. He sank into despair. What could they do against someone like Homelander? They did not stay broken for long. Years of leadership and hard experience steadied them, and they recovered their composure. They argued and searched for options, but there was no easy answer. If Jean could be awakened, Phoenix Jean could wipe Homelander from the sky. But after absorbing Scott, Jean had sealed herself away. She hadn't woken, and whether she would awaken was entirely her own choice. Without that transcendent force, the two of them had to find another way. If it really comes down to it, we'll have to ask Shufu to intervene, Magneto said with a sigh. Charles looked at him. He's still a child. And besides, why should he act for us? He has already done enough for our kind. We cannot demand anything more of him. Neither you nor I are in a position to. Charles's face was grave. Magneto understood. Not everyone could be morally compelled to sacrifice everything for the race. People had their own limits. He would no longer try to force someone like that. Just when hope seemed exhausted, an idea lit up in Magneto's eyes. We don't have to ask him for free. Charles blinked. What do you mean? We can trade, Magneto said. Jean left something behind, didn't she? We can use it to bargain with Shufu. Charles listened as Magneto explained. Years ago, when Jean was young and unstable, she nearly destroyed an entire town. Charles and Magneto had risked their lives to subdue her. Charles sealed away her darker personality, and together they condensed that dangerous energy into a single golden crystal. It was palm-sized but contained an almost unimaginable force, power that, if unleashed, might destroy a nation, far beyond the scale of conventional weapons. Neither of them could use it. It was too dangerous. But as a bargaining chip, it might be enough to buy Shufu's help. We're only offering a trade, Charles said finally. Whether he agrees is up to him. I won't force anyone. That's how it should be, Magneto agreed. They retrieved the crystal and went to find Shufu. When they explained the situation and offered the exchange, Shufu didn't leap at the chance. Killing Homelander would not be difficult for him. He was simply too lazy to bother. But since the two leaders were offering something valuable, it came down to one question. Was the prize worth picking up his fishing pole? Professor, let me see it, Shufu said, deliberately casual. He knew how to behave. When someone offers help, never show too much eagerness, or you invite resentment. Charles smiled gratefully and produced a small, precious box. He handed it to Shufu with solemnity. Shufu opened it. Golden light spilled out, and something like raw life force simmered within. He drew out the palm-sized amber crystal. At once the system in his head pinged and displayed information. Phoenix crystal. A crystal condensed from the Phoenix force. If absorbed, it may allow one to be reborn. Shufu's eyes lit up. The Phoenix Force was a uniquely powerful presence in the Marvel Universe, an embodiment of life and psychic energy. Even a fragment of it carried enormous potency. A tiny crystal that could grant rebirth was priceless. With his own strength, absorbing such energy wouldn't be difficult. The thought made Shufu feel a little embarrassed. He'd clearly come out ahead. His mind worked quickly. He didn't feel like confronting Homelander himself. Why not strengthen these two mutants and let them take their revenge? He had just the thing, super god water. He'd already used most of it, only its purifying function remained useful to him. It was also a renewable resource that could be sold by the kilogram, so trading some of it for a Phoenix crystal was more than fair. Homelander was powerful, but after being enhanced, Magneto and Professor Xavier should be capable of dealing with him. This way, Shufu could keep fishing for opportunities, and Magneto and Charles would gain the power to avenge themselves. Killing 3 birds with 1 stone made him feel smug. He looked up and addressed Professor Xavier. Professor, I'm not interested in handling Homelander myself. Both men showed disappointment, but Shufu only smiled and continued. That doesn't mean I'm unwilling to negotiate. I can give you something that will enhance your abilities. That should be a fair exchange for the Phoenix crystal. Whether we handle it ourselves is ultimately our decision, Charles said. You think it will be enough to deal with Homelander? Magneto asked cautiously. For the Brotherhood's leader to say very strong showed how much Homelander had unnerved him. It depends on how much the item boosts you, Shufu replied confidently. Super God Water was a potent item that could awaken a person's potential. Because of their age and Charles's long illness, they would have to take a diluted dose, but even so, the improvement would be significant. Shufu estimated that stimulating Magneto's potential could extend the range of his powers to the scale of a city. At that level, he would be a walking nuclear weapon. That, certainly, should be enough to handle Homelander. You can trust me, Shufu said. Once you feel it, you'll be confident. He produced a small teapot and poured enough Super God water into 2 small cups for them. Just dilute it with water and drink. Charles and Magneto exchanged looks, then nodded. Back in their room, they followed Shufu's instructions. After diluting the solution, Charles swallowed without hesitation. Magneto did the same. Although the worst of the item's side effects had been mitigated and it was diluted, Super God water still affected Shufu differently than it did them. One was old and frail, the other had long suffered illnesses. Even a weak dose hit them hard. The liquid burned like a mouthful of magma as they swallowed it, and the heat spread outward until it enveloped their bodies. They felt as if they were being steamed from the inside. Cells seemed to simmer and release hidden potential. Every mutant carries enormous latent ability. The most powerful could level a world. What restrains them is the body and the mind. Super God water worked on both, nourishing the soul and fortifying the body. Under its influence, their powers bloomed. The air itself vibrated as Charles's sigh strengthened, ripples of telepathic force that made the atmosphere shiver. Metal within dozens of kilometers began to hum and tremble as Magneto's magnetism surged outward. The transformation was dramatic. The two of them felt their strength nearly double. An hour passed. The agonizing heat slowly faded. They exchanged glances, faces showing the relief of having endured something intense but transformative. "This stuff really works," Charles said. "It's effective, but unbearably painful," Magneto admitted, rubbing his temples. "That's true. This kid didn't even give us a warning," Magneto said, shaking his head. Even with their long experience and the scars of painful eras behind them, both men felt a fresh ache and a stubborn edge of fear. "But whatever this thing is, its effects are impressive." "I can feel my strength has increased dramatically," Charles replied. Magneto closed his hand until his knuckles whitened. His body felt reinforced, and his powers magnified. He could probably manipulate the metal of an entire city now. His strength had changed by orders of magnitude. This should be enough to deal with Homelander. "We can't let him keep acting like this," Charles said. "I have a better idea. Let's hit their base in Africa directly. Remind them that mutants are not to be trifled with." A cold light flashed in Magneto's eyes. Vought hadn't been able to ship everything back to headquarters and had set up an outpost on the edge of a small African city, an installation that, on that continent, looked wealthier than many local towns. Charles agreed, and they decided on a surprise strike at noon the next day. At midday, they stepped through a portal and arrived inside Vought's frontline base. Homelander was there, relaxed and pleased with himself, staring at approval ratings on his phone. He was smiling until a familiar call echoed in his head. "Homelander, get out here!" the voice rang. "You 2 old men ran fast last time," it taunted. "Now you actually have the nerve to come looking for death." Homelander's smile hardened. He rose from the base and cut through the air. "You stray dogs, coming to find me now? Are you courting death?" He laughed, cold and loud. "Let's see who dies." When enemies meet, there is no mercy. Magneto said nothing more. He unleashed his power. Vought's base covered nearly 100 square kilometers, mostly flat land with scattered installations. It had been a U.S. military base once, and vast quantities of metal and equipment still lay there. Magneto wrenched it all apart. Every scrap of metal began to decompose and fly upward. Metal ores from under the ground extracted and broken down into basic particles, coalescing into a dark, swirling cloud. The metal reshaped itself into a colossal hand that reached for Homelander. "Pathetic tricks," Homelander sneered, red flaring in his eyes, and charged the hand. At the same moment, Charles struck with his telepathy. Homelander staggered, as if struck by a hammer to the head. He wavered in the sky and nearly fell. The metal hand closed around him and then unleashed thousands of spikes, each one aimed to pierce. Metal creaked and screamed as the spikes hammered against him, but they could not find purchase. Homelander's body was like diamond. Even atom-level particles left no mark. "A monster," Magneto muttered, surprise flashing across his face. "A monster?" Homelander shouted. "You mutants are the real monsters of this world. I am its hero. Now let me redeem you." He roared. The skin over his chest went translucent, and a glowing red heart beat visibly within him. A searing crimson beam burst from his chest, melting every metal thing in its path. Magneto's massive hand could not withstand it and evaporated. The beam lit up half the sky and shot upward, tearing through the clouds. Panting, Homelander glared at them. "Now do you see true power? Die!" Using that ability was a brutal strain on him. Anyone watching carefully, if Shufu had been there, would have recognized it, the terrifying chest beam of Soldier Boy. In this world, that devastating power had become Homelander's. That blow shattered the balance. Magneto and Charles went pale. The fight between Homelander and Magneto had created an enormous disturbance. The shockwaves from their clash could be felt for thousands of kilometers, and their battle could no longer be hidden. News of the firefight reached Esield, Kamar-Taj, and Vought's boardroom. Edgar at the World Security Council had been hiding the incident, but the commotion was too loud to suppress now. Many outlets and agencies learned about it and moved to act, though none could interfere with the two men already locked in combat. Homelander had almost overwhelmed them, not because Magneto and Charles weren't powerful, but because Homelander was so comprehensive. Flight, enhanced vision, telepathic resilience, superhuman intellect, and a devastatingly strong body gave him a nearly limitless margin for error. Even together, Magneto and Charles were in real danger. On top of that, Homelander had suddenly reverted to brutal Soldier Boy-style tactics, raw, unforgiving power that smashed through technique. A chain, after all, is only as strong as its weakest link. Homelander hovered high above and sneered down. "You two old men, die for me." He swung, and the air itself rippled. The impact thundered across the battlefield for hundreds of meters. Magneto's face drained of color as he drew every nearby scrap of metal into a thick shield before him. The punch shook the metal like a drum. Before they could react, Homelander vanished and reappeared behind Magneto, red light flaring in his eyes as he aimed to cut through him. Charles threw everything into his telepathy. Pain exploded in Homelander's skull, and for a heartbeat he paused, clutching his head. "Retreat," Charles bellowed. "We are not his opponents." "No," Magneto snarled. "I'm not leaving." The thought of their fallen mutant comrades flashed through Magneto's mind, and rage lit his face. The earth trembled as veins of ore that ran for hundreds of meters below were forced upward at his command. The ground split, forming a jagged rift. Two massive, dragon-like columns of metal reared from the earth. Swords, spears, and blades sprang from those columns and launched themselves at Homelander. The weapons struck with a ringing clatter, clang, 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 but they didn't even scrape him. Homelander stood untouched, the metal only sang against him. Despair tightened Magneto's chest. The greatest enemy he had ever faced was standing before him, and his best could not dent him. From above, Homelander watched Magneto's anguish like a vulture tasting the moment. He had already shaken off Charles's mental assault and seemed to relish their helplessness. Then, with no warning, he closed the distance in the blink of an eye. A single brutal fist met Magneto's chest and collapsed it inward. Blood fountained from Magneto's mouth. "Old man," Homelander said, voice syrupy with contempt. "Remember not to mess with me next life. I hate old men who think they can tell everyone what to do." Charles couldn't bear to see his friend die. He pushed his telepathy to its limits, pain tearing from his mouth as he poured blood and power into one last desperate move. The strain cracked him, but he seized Homelander's mind long enough to open a portal. A golden light swallowed Magneto, and Charles dragged him away. When the light faded and Homelander snapped back to himself, annoyance filled his face. They'd escaped. He seethed, furious that they had slipped free, but there was nothing he could do in that moment except remember. He turned and flew back to the remaining half of the forward base. No sooner had he arrived than a projection flickered to life from Vought headquarters. Stan Edgar's impassive face filled the screen, eyes cold as stone. He stared at Homelander and controlled his rage before speaking. "Why did you act without authorization?" Edgar demanded. "Do you have any idea how much damage your actions have caused the company? Do you know how much effort we must now dedicate to cleaning up this mess?" Homelander hadn't even sat down before the reprimand landed. He raised his hands, anger simmering beneath his cool exterior. "Is that supposed to be my fault?" he shot back. "I almost killed the so-called leader of the mutants. Twice. If any of you had been even remotely competent, this place would already be company territory. Don't pin all your failures on me." Homelander suddenly stood, eyes boring into Edgar through the projection. Even over the screen, Edgar felt the force of his anger, that only fueled the anger in his own chest. Homelander, Vought's most prized asset, was slipping out of Edgar's control, something he could not allow. He forced his voice into a flat calm. "You come back to me now," Edgar said. "The company will send someone else to take over operations in Africa." "Impossible." Homelander laughed, sharp and incredulous. "No one can take my place. No one can steal my credit. You can send someone to try." Threat laced his tone. Edgar's laugh in return was cold. "You fool. The strongest of those mutants isn't the pair you nearly killed." He kept his expression impassive, but his words were merciless. Vought had never had the clearance to see the full files on Su-Fu. S-Shield had sealed that information. Edgar only learned the truth when he worked closely with Jillian. Shu-Fu's power was such that even Homelander was outmatched. Edgar wasn't claiming to care for Homelander, only that he could not afford to lose Vought's premier asset. Homelander's face twisted into a mocking smile. "You say I'll find my death?" he snorted. "I don't believe anyone in this world can kill me, not even the Avengers. If it weren't for you idiots, I'd already be the greatest hero on the planet." His voice rose, fury and wounded pride tangled together. Homelander's life had been warped, raised in a lab, starved of family, bred to crave adoration. Worship was the only thing that kept him from becoming monster's kind. Without it, he feared he would descend into bloodlust. He refused to accept Edgar's warning. "I'll prove my worth. I'll prove my power." He flicked his cape and crushed the projection console under his heel. The assistant at his side went pale and nearly collapsed to her knees. Homelander glanced at her with an expressionless flash that made her tremble. Then, bafflingly, a smile slid across his face. If anything, it made her more terrified. "Find me everything on the mutants," he ordered. "Find out who that strongest one is, the one they mentioned. I don't care how you do it. Bring him to me." The assistant covered her mouth and nodded frantically, afraid Homelander might change his mind and punish her. She hurried from the office, spiteful fear and relief warring on her face, and began frantically chasing leads. There was one problem. Edgar controlled much of Vought's intelligence network. A lot of what Vought knew was funneled in from the World Security Council, and Edgar made sure it stayed in his hands. Why would he hand sensitive files over to Homelander, with whom he was at war? The assistant knew this, and she imagined for a moment the lasers that could cut her in two. Then something unexpected happened. Inside Vought, internal politics were messy. Edgar and Homelander were enemies, but Jillian was above such petty loyalties. To him, people were pawns and Vought merely a more valuable pawn. If Homelander's actions in Africa could net a haul of living mutants, Jillian imagined the possibilities. If normal mutants could help create advanced serums and therapies, imagine what the potions from the truly powerful might yield. Capturing a few of those mutants could deliver breakthroughs they couldn't get any other way, perhaps even things bordering on immortality. For Jillian, Homelander's bloodthirst was an opportunity, so a file bypassed Edgar entirely and slipped into Homelander's assistant's hands. She didn't care how it had arrived, she only needed to survive. The intelligence was authentic. She handed it to Homelander without hesitation. He skimmed it, then tossed it down with disdain. "Always on the beach outside Genosha? Still fishing?" he muttered, half to himself. "I've killed so many mutants and they hardly flinch." He smirked. "They call me the Executioner, as if that's a stain. Hypocritical. Pathetic." With a sweep of his cape, he left the office and shot up into the sky. Word of his departure spread quickly through Vought and beyond. Despite its power, Vought had holes like a sieve where curious, interested parties could look in. S-Shield and Hydra alike had been watching Homelander. Now both would focus on him even more intently. Chapter 118, Homelander had been in the spotlight for weeks. Dangerous anomalies like him were watched constantly. S.H. Shield had even put a high-tech satellite on him. It wasn't just the agency or the government keeping an eye. Every powerful being who could had taken notice of this fanatical self-proclaimed hero. Sorcerer Supreme Gu Yi was among them. The greatest mage on Earth, master of Kamar-Taj and a Skyfather-level force, stared into a magical display. Her eyes flickered with strange, shimmering strands, as if a river of time flowed just beneath the surface. In her hand, an ancient bronze-green relic unfurled, pulsing with a pale green light. She was using the Time Stone's power to peer into time, into fate itself, and her expression was grim. "Fate is shrouded in mist," she murmured. Why? Doubt shadowed her features. At her level, any intervention required a hard calculus. The consequences for the future, how the river of fate might shift. During the Battle of New York, she had stood in the temple and could have wiped out the Chitauri with a gesture, saving the city. She had not acted, because even a single change could trigger a butterfly effect, creating greater disasters down the line. By that same logic, Homelander's killing now might be another such pivot. So she watched quietly from the dark, an observer rather than an interferer. She was not alone in her silence. Far away, across the void and above Asgard, Odin too was watching. The disruption caused by Shufu's existence had not only rippled across Earth, it had reached even distant Asgard. In the original timeline, Asgard would be reeling under a dark elf invasion now. Frigga would have died, Odin would have been consumed by grief and weakened, his lifespan running thin and his power ebbing until he was cast down to Earth by Loki. None of that had happened. Odin, sensing that the threads of destiny had shifted, could trace the change back to Earth. Through the World Tree's ancient sight, he could see across half the universe. Homelander, this newly emergent anomaly, had drawn his attention. The man's reckless, capricious decisions had not only stirred humanity, but had pulled the gaze of countless cosmic powers. For a moment, the tumult of the world stilled, the universe waited. Homelander, however, had no sense of the larger consequences. Relying on his abilities, he'd flown to the coordinates provided by his intelligence. His cape whispered behind him as he descended until he hovered before Shufu, hands clasped behind his back, looking down with the pure arrogance of someone used to being obeyed. "Are you Shufu?" he asked, voice flat. The young man on the ground blinked. Homelander's manner was aggressive, his tone condescending, so much so that Shufu found it more amusing than frightening. He was lounging in a folding chair with a fishing rod in hand, enjoying the sun. To him, someone gloating like this was almost a novelty. People who made trouble for others were often just that, trouble. Shufu ignored him and focused on his line. Homelander read contempt in the man's posture, and unused to being disregarded, his temper flared. "Boy, I'm talking to you," he snapped. Shufu made a sound like a scoff and kept holding his rod. That small show of disdain made Homelander's eyes go hard. Red light bloomed behind his irises, the lethal beam he used as casually as a glance. It built, terrifying and hot, and he unleashed it straight at Shufu, intending to vaporize him in an instant. He expected the scream, the collapse, the finality. Instead, the beam hit the ground and seared a perfectly clean patch into the earth, its intensity sufficient to melt stone into glass. Shufu didn't flinch. He wasn't even singed. He lay there perfectly unharmed and fixed Homelander with a look that was neither fear nor surprise, but something colder, mild irritation. Homelander's brow furrowed. The first blast had missed, or so he thought. He aimed again, even harder, red light flaring, but the outcome was the same. The ground beneath Shufu melted and crystallized, yet Shufu himself remained untouched, as if protected by something Homelander could not comprehend. Now, for the first time, Homelander saw Shufu clearly, saw the calm indifference, the casual amusement, and the realization that his power had failed in this one instance spread through him like a chill. Shufu relied on his incredible speed and dodged the attack in an instant, narrowly avoiding being sliced in half by the terrifying laser beam. His speed was so great that even Homelander could only discern it with effort. "Impressive. You have some tricks," Homelander sneered but said no more. What did speed matter to him? A train was fast too, but to Homelander that was nothing. He sized Shufu up, but Shufu returned the stare with obvious displeasure. He had been enjoying a quiet night of fishing. This man had come over to cause trouble. Did he really want to die? Judging by the power and the markings on his body, Shufu already knew who he was facing, the famous Crescent Flash, Homelander. Standing on a tall building at night, broadcasting his arrogance to the moon, hardly the behavior of an ordinary person. Shufu could understand the performance, but that didn't mean he liked it. To him, Homelander was an irritating mosquito. If he didn't swat him, the annoyance would never go away. Since Homelander had come to his spot, it was as good a time as any to settle scores. Shufu didn't attack. He calmly packed his fishing gear instead. That nonchalance enraged Homelander. "How dare you?" he roared. Shufu's silence and purposeful packing said everything. He was being dismissed. Blood came rushing to Homelander's head. He had come to confront Shufu, and now the man acted like the victim. The indignity made him want to kill Shufu on the spot. "Die," Homelander hissed, and a red beam like a razor shot toward him. It crackled with murderous intent. Shufu acted as if he hadn't seen it. While moving, he casually waved a hand, and the beam was slapped aside. Homelander's eyes widened. He had never seen a human brush off an energy blast. Was this even possible? By the time the shock registered, Shufu had finished packing and looked up at Homelander with cool indifference. "Homelander," he said, "who let you come and cause trouble?" Homelander replied, outraged. Shufu put his things away and stood on the ground, staring up. The pressure he radiated was unusual. Even Homelander felt a prickle of unease. That only made him angrier. To feel fear confronted him. Unacceptable. "No one tells me what to do," Homelander said arrogantly. "I do as I please." "So it was your idea to come here," Shufu replied. "If you hadn't provoked me, I wouldn't have bothered with you. But since you came to my door, then I can only ask you to die." "Preposterous," Homelander scoffed. "You're just a mutant. Who do you think you are, saying you'll kill me to my face? Do you know what you're saying?" He laughed, the sound forced and brash. The bravado was all surface. The more threatened he felt, the louder he snarled. Shufu saw through him at once. Outwardly powerful, Homelander was inwardly fragile. Without his power, he would likely be worse off than an ordinary man. "So you're very strong?" Homelander demanded. "I am the strongest," Homelander declared, eyes blazing. "Mutants are flawed goods." Shufu hardly bothered to reply. The more ignorant someone was, the more certain they seemed. Homelander's arrogance revealed the same kind of manufactured superiority as the experiments that made him. Mutants, Shufu thought, were created by nature. Some were even stronger than gods. People like Scarlet Witch could, in a moment, threaten cosmic beings. Homelander calling mutants inferior was the height of arrogance. "You talk big," Shufu said. "I just don't know if your strength matches your talk." As soon as the words fell, Shufu's body flickered. In the next instant, he was standing directly in front of Homelander, as if he'd teleported. His movement had been faster than sound, yet left no air ripple. Homelander's pupils narrowed, and by reflex, he threw a punch. With his terrifying power, his body itself was a weapon. The force behind that blow could unleash more destruction than a missile. One single strike could level a mountain. An ordinary person, an elephant, even a dinosaur, would be obliterated by such a hit. The punch screamed toward Shufu with the force of a natural disaster. Shufu, however, had already blurred into motion, so fast he was almost a streak. The fist passed through the space he'd occupied a heartbeat before. Shufu reappeared calmly behind Homelander, and without raising his voice, said, "You should stop talking." The first punch landed against Shufu with only a muted thud. Shufu didn't even budge. Homelander watched, unbelieving as the impossible showed itself. He finally understood, in a flash, what it must have felt like for Magneto when he'd been struck. Homelander hadn't even had time to react before Shufu closed his hand around his fist. He tried to pull back with every ounce of strength he had, but his arm would not move. Shufu's grip was like cast iron, unmoving, absolute. Homelander's face flushed red. With a burst of effort, he managed to wrench his hand free, but it felt like breaking through a wall. Shufu merely flicked imaginary dust from his chest and spoke casually, as if commenting on the weather. "You said your power was great? You're fond of fighting? What good is fighting alone?" He let go, flicking his fingers. Homelander staggered back several steps. Each step left ripples in the air. "Dong! Dong!" Dong! 3 quick impacts, and he stabilized, looking at his own indestructible skin, and for the first time in his life, he saw bruises. From childhood through adulthood, he had never had marks like these. They healed almost instantly, but the fear remained. You said you were very strong? Shufu's eyes were like a motionless pool. Homelander's anger flared. Red light glowed in his eyes, veins pulsing crimson under his skin. His blood raced with a sound like a roaring river. I don't believe it, he shouted. Your power can never be stronger than mine. He launched himself at Shufu, a blur, and threw a straight punch. Shufu didn't speak. He only shifted his hand to block, and the force of Homelander's fist slid off, missing his chest and striking over his shoulder. Shufu took a step forward and shoved. Homelander was blasted away like an erupting volcano. He flew, powerless to stop until he engaged his flight and slammed to a halt thousands of meters away. Shufu didn't pursue. His face stayed calm. Your technique is poor, he said. Even with power, you're just a brute. When there's an absolute disparity of strength, like Superman against normal men, even the best skill cannot pierce the stronger one. That was the gap between them. Shufu's power and his superior combat technique made Homelander's raw strength look trivial. It was total domination. When you use your power against the weak, Shufu said quietly, have you ever thought the same could happen to you? Before Homelander could reply, Shufu reappeared before him. A fist drove into him. Homelander crossed his arms to try to block and felt his arms go numb and burn with pain as if struck deep. He swung uselessly. The pain lessened quickly. He had inherited Soldier Boy's energy, after all, which amplified his strength, toughness, and healing speed. The numbness faded, and the wound disappeared almost instantly. You're just using sneak attacks, Homelander spat. If you have real strength, fight me head-on. Shufu smiled faintly. This time, he planned more than just to beat Homelander physically. He wanted to punish his pride. He wanted Homelander to understand how insignificant his vaunted power was. Fine, Shufu said. Then I'll let you try your so-called power. He hovered in midair, utterly still, as if daring Homelander to act. Homelander exploded with fury. No one had ever shown him such contempt. His red and white cape, like a torn flag, whipped in the wind as he rocketed forward, gathering a terrifying pressure. The air around his fist roiled and twisted. Red energy surged beneath his skin like a storm. A hurricane formed in front of him, even before he arrived. Shufu didn't flinch. A faint golden shimmer flickered over him, and the gale dissipated as if cut by a knife. When Homelander's fist reached Shufu's face, it connected, yet not in the way Homelander expected. Where the fist met Shufu, the impact was absorbed and redirected. Homelander felt an unfamiliar feedback, a wrenching force that bent him back like a reed. He was thrown bodily through the air again, but this time the throw was more brutal, more humiliating. He smashed through buildings and clouds, rocketing kilometers before his flight could slow him. He hit the ground with a thunderous impact, carving a crater. For a moment he could not move, rage and disbelief braided together. The bruises his power left healed instantly, but the impression they made on his mind did not fade. No matter how quickly his body recovered, the knowledge that someone had so easily dominated him burned. Shufu floated down slowly, his expression untouched, as if it were all merely a lesson. When you bully the weak, he said softly, someone stronger will always rise. Homelander pushed himself up, red energy flaring wildly. His chest heaved. The more it didn't go his way, the more frantic his attacks became. He charged again, a living hurricane of power and pride. Each blow meant to end it. Every strike met the same result. Precise, minimal movement from Shufu neutralized and punished him, sending him airborne time and again. It went on until even Homelander's burning rage began to cool into a quieter, sharper thing, fear laced with humiliation. He had been the one to terrify others his whole life. Never had anyone made him feel so exposed. Shufu finally stepped forward, close enough that Homelander could see the unreadable calm in his eyes. He didn't shout, didn't gloat. He simply looked at the fallen hero and said, "Power without restraint is only a weapon for the weak to hide behind." Homelander stared back, chest heaving, cape tattered around him, and beneath the fury a small, dark seed of doubt had been planted, one that would not be so easily erased by healing or rhetoric.